If you love animated content that breaks down book summaries and dives into fascinating topics, we'd love your support. Creating these videos takes a lot of time and effort, and by subscribing, you help us continue bringing you this valuable content consistently. Your support means the world to us. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this exciting journey. And now, let's continue with the video. Think again. Chapter 1: Think Like a Scientist. Although the name Mike Lazaridis may not be immediately familiar to you, he almost certainly impacted your life. Lazaridis was the founder of BlackBerry. He originally conceived of it as a wireless device able to send and receive email. In the summer of 2009, BlackBerry occupied half of the market share for smartphones. By 2014, however, it was down to less than 1%. What led to BlackBerry's downfall? It was Lazaridis' inability to rethink his long-held opinions and respond to changing trends. For example, as early as 1997, a top engineer suggested adding an internet browser to BlackBerry, but Lazaridis wanted to stick to his original idea of an email device. When the iPhone was released in 2007, Lazaridis still didn't want to add web. He refused to think people actually wanted a computer in their pocket. And even when it came to changing the keyboard to a touchscreen, Lazaridis insisted that the BlackBerry was perfect as it was. It's an iconic product. It's used by business. It's used by leaders. It's used by celebrities, Lazaridis said in 2011. Lazaridis' refusal to adapt meant that by 2012 the iPhone, which offered incredible computing power, had taken over more than a quarter of the market. Organizational psychologist Adam Grant, in his newest book Think Again, uses Lazaridis as an example of a mistake we all make. When we're overconfident in our own opinions, we often double down when it's actually time to rethink. We see sticking to our guns as a virtue, but in a constantly changing world, it can be a liability. To grow and thrive, we need to embrace the possibility of changing our minds, not simply assuaging our egos. To embrace rethinking, let's first consider how most of us think and talk. Grant argues that we likely utilize three personas: preacher, politician, or prosecutor. The preacher's aim is to protect and promote their ideals. We utilize this persona when we evangelize about what matters to us. The prosecutor's goal is to prove the other side wrong, such as when all you want to do is point out your counterpart's flawed logic. The politician wants approval from their audience, like when we let our opinions be swayed by our desire to be well-liked. The risk of these personas is they don't create space to rethink. Thus, Grant believes we need to embody a new persona, the scientist. Scientists are charged to embrace doubt and consider various hypotheses, all while searching for reasons why they might be wrong. Thinking like scientists will encourage us to move past bad ideas and help us improve based on what we've learned. For example, in a study where entrepreneurs were instructed to think like scientists or to think normally, the scientists made more revenue. That's because the entrepreneurs were not afraid to be wrong and consequently pivoted twice as much. If Lazaridis had thought like a scientist, who knows what the smartphone market would look like now? Moving forward, we'll learn how rethinking can improve how we negotiate, how we think about our careers, and more. Chapter 2: Embrace Being Wrong. Many of us struggle to admit when we're wrong. Often, it's because our opinions are tied to our identity, how we view the world, or how we view ourselves. How can we look at the world more objectively in order to change our minds when we need to? Grant gained some insights after meeting Jean-Pierre Bugums, a professional forecaster who was particularly adept at changing his mind. As a forecaster, Bugums had long competed in tournaments where he made bets on various life events. Then, in 2015, many political statisticians, pundits, and forecasters began to debate the likelihood of Trump becoming the 2016 Republican nominee in July. Few experts thought he had a real shot. Famous political statistician Nate Silver had estimated his odds of winning at 6%, for example. This collective disregard for Trump likely stemmed from the fact that most experts struggled to imagine a world where he could be president. Bugums, however, surprised his colleagues in November when he estimated that Donald Trump actually had a 68% chance of winning. This isn't to say Bugums had always felt this way. He too couldn't imagine a Trump presidency, and as of the spring had estimated a 2% chance. What made him rethink his opinion? Bugums was able to change his mind because he thought like a scientist, Grant says. When Trump started to rise in the polls in August, Bugums decided to embrace being wrong. Bugums had another advantage. Since he was a forecaster and not a political pundit, he wasn't married to estimating in a traditional way. The statisticians were attached to their views about how to aggregate polls. He paid more attention to factors that were hard to measure and overlooked, Grant says. So, when he estimated the likelihood of Trump's nomination, Bugums drew up an entire list of why he and other pundits might be wrong about Trump. Through this exercise, he found flaws in their previous arguments. For example, the general consensus that Trump was a fringe candidate was false. He was actually popular among several key demographics. Research shows that coming up with even a single reason why we might be wrong is enough to help us change our minds. Even after this reckoning, Bugums struggled to accept his new prediction. It hurt to imagine a Trump win, so in 2016, he bet on Clinton. His unwillingness to imagine a Trump win is an example of the desirability bias, allowing your preference to affect your judgment. Nowadays, Bugums has adopted a unique strategy to limit the influence of the desirability bias. When he makes a prediction, he drafts a list with circumstances in which he's likely to be right, as well as those that will require him to change his mind. When you form an opinion, ask yourself what would have to happen to prove it false. Then keep track of your views so you can see when you were right, when you were wrong, and how your thinking has evolved. Adam Grant. Chapter 3: How to Convince Others. Think again. Once we're willing to rethink our opinions, how can we get others to do the same? To find out, Grant observed two avid debaters in action, international champion Harish Natarajan and project debater, AI created by IBM. Grant attended their debate, which focused on the question, should the government subsidize preschools? Project debater was given the task of arguing for preschool subsidies, while Natarajan debated against. Their goal was to convince the audience. Going in, 92% of the audience had already made up their mind. The majority felt that preschools should be subsidized. With the audience mostly on project debater's side from the get-go, one would think it must have had the upper hand. In some ways, project debater did have more advantages. It had access to over 400 million articles and was equipped to identify useful arguments. It could weigh evidence and even come off personably, making jokes while rapidly citing compelling specific papers and studies. In the end, however, Natarajan influenced the audience the most. He convinced 30% to oppose subsidies and reduced the in favor to 62%. He succeeded, Grant explains, by doing something that project debater was incapable of doing: finding common ground. Finding common ground, or showing what you and your counterpart both agree on, is an important way to appeal to the audience and move a debate forward. Natarajan began his debate by acknowledging what both sides could agree on: preschool is important. He said, "Let me start by examining the main claim, that if we believe preschools are good in principle, surely it is worth giving money to subsidize them." After highlighting their common ground, Natarajan argued that the importance of preschools doesn't necessarily justify subsidies. And although project debater was capable of coming up with a multitude of counter-arguments, it couldn't reach a consensus like Natarajan could. Natarajan accepted that the point was valid, which allowed him to relate to his opponent's perspective and to the audience's, Grant explains. When polled afterwards, audience members stated that they learned more from the computer, and yet it was Natarajan that swayed their opinions. This is because when people have predetermined opinions, listing multiple facts to the contrary won't change their minds. To change their minds, people first need to be receptive to the possibility they're wrong at all. This can be accomplished by avoiding an adversarial approach. Finding common ground will show your counterpart that you're not digging in your heels and that you see the logic in their argument. Natarajan offers a simple tactic for finding common ground. Rather than consider the weak points of your counterpart's argument, focus on the strong suits. Point out the best parts of your counterpart's argument and acknowledge that they're right in some regard. Then utilize open-ended questions like, is there any evidence that could change your mind? To put the onus on your counterpart to reconsider their perspective. The only person likely to change someone's mind is themselves. By asking questions and remaining open yourself, you'll give them space to rethink. Chapter 4: Defying Stereotypes. Think again. Stereotypes and prejudices are incredibly common among rival groups. For example, some Republicans may view Democrats as dishonest snowflakes, while some Democrats view Republicans as greedy and ignorant. If we want to solve society's biggest issues, how can we get groups with deep-seated prejudices, whether political, racial, or ideological, to rethink their beliefs? To find out, Grant and his research team studied a unique rivalry that has gone on for over a century: Red Sox fans versus Yankees fans. This rivalry is so ingrained that neuroscientists can see it. When Red Sox fans are shown Yankees' failure, the brain regions related to reward and pleasure light up. To begin his study, Grant asked each group to list 3 negative things about their rivals. They mostly use similar words, like obnoxious, aggressive, and arrogant. Grant explains that stereotypes like these, once formed, are difficult to shed for 2 reasons. For one, these stereotypes form reality goggles. They inform how we see the world, and any challenge to our worldview is hard to internalize. Secondly, these stereotypes stay with us because we surround ourselves with people who share them. So how did Grant get these rival groups to rethink their prejudice? Grant and his team tried a few different tactics to broaden the perspective of each group. The first was to encourage them to think about the thing they did have in common, their love of baseball. But acknowledging this shared interest didn't help. One Red Sox fan still told Grant, "The Yankees suck, and their fans are annoying." The second was to humanize the group members. Grant shared a letter with Red Sox fans written by a baseball lover about his most treasured memories. At the end, the letter writer mentions that he's a Yankees fan. Rather than dispel their prejudices, Red Sox fans argued that this person was an exception to the rule. Lastly, Grant had rival members list 3 positive and 3 negative characteristics about the fans of the other team. The positive attributes included things like passionate, dedicated, and loyal. Then half of the participants were randomly assigned to think about how arbitrary their rivalry was. He asked them to consider a counterfactual question, like if they had grown up anywhere else, would they be as devout towards their team? Afterwards, both groups were given the opportunity to negatively impact the rival groups. Those who had considered arbitrariness were less likely to do so. How can this extend to the real world, where prejudices can be even more precarious? Grant encourages us to think counterfactually and consider what the world would look like if we lived in an alternate reality. We can use counterfactual questions to reckon with the arbitrariness of our opinions and rethink our ingrained perceptions. Chapter 5: Having Difficult Conversations. Think again. Most of us have something we strongly believe in. Perhaps it's that gun ownership is a right, or that everyone should have access to healthcare. When passion comes into play, how can we find common ground with those who disagree with us? Psychologist Peter Coleman offers some insight. Over the last 20 years, he's run the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University. Coleman's goal is to see what helps people find common ground when they actively disagree on polarizing issues. In his experiments, disagreeing pairs of participants are given 20 minutes to discuss a controversial topic, like abortion. Their job is to agree as a pair on this topic enough so that they can write a joint statement to be published on a public forum. Before these conversations, participants read a news article about another divisive issue like gun control. Unbeknownst to participants, these articles vary. One version is binary and argues both sides of the issue. The other version describes the issue in more nuanced terms with various points of view. 54% of pairs who received the binary version were unable to reach an agreement on the original issue. 100% of pairs who received the nuanced version reached an agreement. Furthermore, if participants were given the binary article, they were more likely to spend their time defending their side, rather than listen to their partners. If they received the nuanced article, participants made twice as many comments highlighting common ground rather than about their own views. The nuanced article didn't just assist in broadening perspectives for the issues at hand, but affected how participants thought of other issues afterwards. Simply by having individuals consider problems as more nuanced, they were able to rethink their stance and left the conversation more satisfied, Grant argues. After these conversations, Coleman played recordings of them back to participants and asked how they were feeling moment to moment. He mapped out over 500 of these conversations and discovered the least productive were those that included 1 or 2 dominant feelings. Nuanced conversations led to more nuanced emotions. If there are more emotions, Grant argues, there is also an increased potential for rethinking. If we understand our feelings aren't black and white, then neither are these issues. We can change our minds if we need to. Psychologists have a term for our tendency to see things in black and white, the binary bias. Seeing things in binaries helps us understand them more easily. Social media has only heightened this tendency. We're able to see 2 sides to common debates unfold, but don't really get to see the gray area. For example, climate change is often described in terms of believers and deniers. But Grant shows that in reality, the conversation is much more nuanced. Despite this, climate change deniers are more often the focus of the media's attention. So, what can we do if we want to improve how we discuss and find common ground for difficult issues? Add gray areas. Gray areas can come in the form of caveats or contingencies. If we avoid saying definite statements, we invite more nuance into our conversations. You can accomplish this by avoiding statements like underscore underscore is always good or underscore underscore is always bad. Chapter 6: Rethink Your Life. Most of us have been asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Grant believes that this question is problematic as it implies there is only one thing you can aspire to be. It also implies that once you choose that one profession, you should continue doing it for the rest of your life. But in fact, sticking to a specific idea of what to do with our lives can have the opposite effect intended. Rather than inspire us, it can give us tunnel vision and potentially force us to commit to something that isn't right. This is what occurred with Grant's cousin, Ryan. From a young age, Ryan knew he wanted to be a doctor. His great-grandparents, Russian immigrants who struggled to barely make ends meet, always dreamt of having a doctor in the family. Ryan excelled in science and math and continuously advanced in his journey to become a doctor. Despite this success, he was often uncertain. Ryan was gregarious and bubbly and felt he might be better suited for another career, perhaps in business. But Ryan couldn't let go of this inherited idea of who he was supposed to be. Gotta stay on track, he often thought to himself. Ryan is now a neurosurgeon, but told Grant that if given the chance to do it all again, he probably would have taken a different route. Why was it so hard for Ryan to shed his dream of being a doctor for something that might have made him happier? Grant explains that when we have a specific vision for our lives, we may fall prey to escalation of commitment. Escalation of commitment means that when something isn't going as planned, we tend to double down and sink more resources into the plan, Grant says. Escalation of commitment can be born out of identity foreclosure. We settle into a specific idea of ourselves and don't consider other options. To avoid settling into one identity, Grant recommends treating your professional and personal life like your health. Have a checkup twice a year where you ask yourself key questions about your professional and personal life to ensure that you're still fulfilled. Considering new career options can be scary, so Grant offers a framework to help you think like a scientist. First, identify possible selves by looking towards people you admire and their day-to-day. Then, develop hypotheses about how their paths might align with the values that matter most to you. Afterwards, try it out. Do informational interviews, shadow people you admire, or do sample work. Your goal isn't to decide something overnight, but rather to keep yourself open to the idea that you can, and sometimes should, change your mind. This can even extend to your personal life. If you're looking for a partner, take time to reconsider what kind of person you're looking for. Having consistent check-ins with yourself will give you the space to rethink your future and ensure you're not afraid to pivot. The main ideas, Chapter 6. You should embrace rethinking your professional and personal life. Escalation of commitment can cause us to dig in our heels, even when our plans aren't panning out. Have bi-yearly check-ins with yourself to ensure your current plans are still fulfilling you. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this exciting journey.